They spent $93 billion in 13 years building what was supposed to be America's inevitable return to the moon. A giant rocket, a deep space crew capsule, a lunar space station, 2 competing landers, a web of international partnerships stretching from Europe to Japan to Canada to the Middle East. On paper, it looked unstoppable. It looked like the clean, logical sequel to Apollo. It looked like history was simply waiting for NASA to arrive and reclaim it. But by 2026, that entire story had started to fall apart. Not in one dramatic explosion, not in one single failure that everyone could point to and say, that's where it broke. Artemis was breaking in the slower, uglier way massive institutions usually break. In delayed schedules, in cost overruns, in dependencies stacked on top of dependencies, in systems that only worked if 6 other things worked first, in public optimism that drifted further and further away from private engineering reality. And then Jared Isaacman walked in and blew up the old plan. That is the cleanest way to say it. Because what happened in early 2026 was not a mild revision. It was not bureaucratic housekeeping. It was one of the sharpest strategic pivots NASA has made in modern history. Isaacman was not some career administrator who spent 30 years in a federal office learning how to move paper from one desk to another. He was a billionaire fintech entrepreneur. He commanded Polaris Dawn. He performed the first commercial spacewalk. This was a man who had literally floated in the vacuum of space and then stepped into NASA leadership carrying a level of impatience the old plan could not survive. And within weeks, he forced the agency to admit something it had resisted admitting for years. The original Artemis roadmap was not working. That admission alone was seismic. NASA almost never says that out loud. Large agencies rarely tell the public that the architecture everyone has been defending, funding, and selling is fundamentally flawed. They delay. They reframe. They speak in softer language. But Isaacman looked at the data, looked at the launch rate, looked at the lander schedule, looked at the technical bottlenecks, and concluded that the program was trying to sprint on broken legs. The problem wasn't ambition. Artemis had plenty of ambition. The problem was that ambition had outrun execution so badly that the entire program risked collapsing under its own promises. On February 27, 2026, Isaacman laid out the core problem bluntly. Launching the SLS once every 3 years while trying to introduce major upgrades at the same time was not a path to success. That sentence cut straight through years of spin, because that was the disease inside Artemis. The program was trying to do too much, too slowly, with too little margin for error, and with far too many pieces depending on technologies that still hadn't proven they could work in the real world. Look at Starship, the vehicle NASA was depending on to actually put astronauts on the moon. By that point, it had suffered 5 failures across 11 test flights. More importantly, the single most critical requirement for turning Starship into a lunar lander had never been demonstrated, transferring propellant between 2 separate vehicles in orbit. Not once, and that was not some optional extra. That was the central trick the whole architecture depended on. Without orbital refueling, the lunar version of Starship does not get the fuel it needs to travel to the moon, land, operate, and return. Then came the leaked internal planning document from late 2025 showing the earliest realistic crewed lunar landing might not happen until September 2028. NASA's own safety advisors had already warned that the Starship human landing system schedule was severely challenged and could slip by years. In other words, the red flags were already everywhere. Isaacman simply stopped pretending not to see them. Then, he moved fast. 3 weeks later, at NASA's so-called Ignition Day event on March 24th, he dropped the bombshell that sent shockwaves through the entire international space community. Lunar Gateway, the station meant to orbit the moon as a staging node for future missions, was being paused in its current form, just like that. A project carrying roughly $5.3 billion in commitments suddenly entered limbo. International partners who had spent years building real hardware found themselves staring into uncertainty. ESA had already invested heavily in modules such as IHAB. JAXA had major commitments. Canada and the UAE were in the architecture. Hardware was not hypothetical. It was real, physical, expensive, and already under construction. And overnight, the message to partners was basically this: we'll tell you later whether the work you've spent years doing still fits. That alone would have been an extraordinary shakeup. But Isaacman didn't stop there. NASA also killed SLS Block 1B, the upgraded version of the giant rocket that Boeing had been developing. That version would have used a new exploration upper stage to increase payload capability and support the next phase of lunar missions. Alongside that decision came a stop work order on Mobile Launcher 2, the $2.5 billion launch platform being built specifically to support Block 1B at Kennedy Space Center. So in a span of weeks, NASA paused a lunar space station, killed the upgraded SLS, halted work on a multi-billion-dollar launch platform, and rewrote the role of its next flagship mission. That is not trimming around the edges. That is a controlled detonation. The reason was brutal and simple. The old plan was too slow, too expensive, too fragile, and too full of simultaneous moving parts. It looked grand on PowerPoint. It looked far less convincing when mapped against real launch cadence, technical readiness, and political time. And the first mission to show just how dramatically the philosophy had changed was Artemis II. This mission was supposed to be the one, the return, the textbook image, the first woman on the moon, the first person of color to walk on another world, the triumphant moment that justified a decade of expense and delay. The headline NASA had been selling to the world. That version of Artemis III is gone. In its place is something that, in one sense, sounds far less exciting and, in another, is far more honest. A roughly 30-day test flight in Earth orbit targeted for around mid-2027. No lunar landing, no moonwalk, no South Pole descent. Instead, Artemis III is now being designed to test whether Orion can rendezvous and dock with commercial landers in orbit. That is a profound downgrade in spectacle and a profound upgrade in realism, because this is the part the old narrative tried to glide past. Before you send humans down to the lunar surface in a multi-vehicle architecture, you need to prove the vehicles can actually find each other, dock with each other, transfer crews, and operate together under mission conditions. That is not a trivial systems check. It is the foundation of the entire mission chain. And the truth is, NASA had allowed itself to talk publicly as if it were standing right on the edge of a landing, while privately, many of the most basic operational questions were still unresolved. Would Artemis III dock with Starship? Blue Moon? Both? What orbit would the mission use? Would the crew test the new spacesuits in a spacewalk? Even after the redesign, many of those questions remained open. That alone tells you how unfinished the old vision really was. The smartest way to understand Artemis III now is to compare it to Apollo 9. Before Apollo 11 landed on the moon, Apollo 9 tested the lunar module in Earth orbit. It was a systems mission, a proving ground mission, a mission built around the logic that great leaps are only possible if the steps underneath them are real. Apollo didn't jump straight to the landing, it built toward it. Artemis tried to act like it could shortcut that logic. Now it is being dragged back to it. And frankly, that may be the best thing that could have happened to the program. Because if Artemis III works in its new form, it will do something much more valuable than deliver a pretty headline. It will restore credibility. It will show that NASA has finally stopped pretending the plan is sound just because the slogan is attractive. But the delay history on this mission is still staggering. Artemis III was once aiming for 2024, then 2025, then 2026, then September 2026, then 2027, then January 2028, and now it has been transformed into a fundamentally different mission entirely. 7 schedule changes across roughly 9 years. That is not just delay, that is structural instability. Still, all of this testing is supposed to clear the way for the mission that now matters most, Artemis IV. Artemis IV is now targeting early 2028. And if it succeeds, it will become the first crewed lunar landing since Apollo 17 touched down on December 14, 1972. More than 55 years, human beings walked on the moon before the personal computer, before the internet, before smartphones, before email became part of daily life. Then we stopped. Not because the moon vanished, not because it became less important, but because the political will, economic structure, and long-term architecture to sustain that effort were never built. Artemis IV is now being asked to restart that story. 4 astronauts will launch aboard the SLS and Orion from Kennedy Space Center. 2 will stay in lunar orbit. 2 will descend to the South Pole in whichever commercial lander is ready first. Isaac Mann has been direct about this. The first company to deliver a functioning lander gets the mission. That means SpaceX and Blue Origin are no longer just contractors. They are in a direct sprint for one of the most historic prizes in modern spaceflight. No crew has been officially named yet, but NASA has maintained one promise through every rewrite of the program. This mission will place the first woman and the first person of color on the lunar surface. That commitment has survived the chaos because it speaks to the symbolic layer of Artemis, the layer NASA knows still matters even as the engineering gets uglier underneath. But Artemis IV is not just symbolic. It is scientifically and operationally more ambitious than anything Apollo ever attempted on the surface. 2 astronauts are expected to spend about 1 week near the lunar South Pole, up to 4 moonwalks, about 6 hours each. Surface setup, geological sampling, instrument deployment, collection of material from ejecta blankets thrown out by ancient impacts, geotechnical measurements, environmental monitoring, experiments tied directly to using lunar resources. This is not Flags and Footprints 2.0. Apollo 11 spent about 21 hours on the surface. Apollo 17, the longest stay of the program, spent roughly 75 hours across 3 days. Artemis IV aims for around 170 hours on the moon. That is a completely different operational mindset. Not a brief visit, but an early rehearsal for working there. And the science package reveals just how serious that shift is. One instrument, LEM, is a compact seismometer built to run autonomously for up to 2 years, detecting moonquakes and potentially forming the first node in a new global lunar seismic network. That matters because the Apollo seismic network went silent in 1977. Nearly half a century later, lunar seismology could finally restart. Another experiment, LEAF, is one of the most quietly revolutionary in the whole mission set. It will test plant growth and photosynthesis under actual lunar gravity and radiation conditions. Humanity has grown plants in microgravity on the ISS, but the moon's 1/6 gravity is different. If humans are ever going to grow food off Earth in a sustainable way, then understanding biological function in lunar conditions is not a side quest, it is a first principle. The third instrument, a lunar dielectric analyzer developed with JAXA and the University of Tokyo, will study the electrical properties of the lunar regolith to help identify subsurface water ice. Again, this is not abstract science. This is reconnaissance for survival and industry. And that brings us to the lunar South Pole itself, arguably the single most important region in the future of human spaceflight. The South Pole matters for 3 brutal, practical reasons: water, power, and novelty. First, water. Permanently shadowed regions inside polar craters may contain enormous stores of water ice preserved over billions of years. These are not places that receive occasional sunlight. Some of them have not seen sunlight in over 2 billion years. They are among the coldest environments in the entire solar system. Ancient comet and asteroid impacts delivered volatiles, and those volatiles stayed trapped in the darkness. That ice is scientifically priceless, but it is also operational gold. Break water into hydrogen and oxygen, and suddenly the moon can provide drinking water, breathable air, and rocket fuel. The moment you can make fuel on the moon instead of hauling every drop from Earth, the economics of space exploration change completely. Second, power. The same region that hides permanent darkness also offers near-perpetual sunlight on elevated ridges and peaks such as Malapert Massif. Those areas receive sunlight so consistently that they are ideal sites for solar power generation. On a world where the night lasts 14 Earth days and surface temperatures can plunge below -200 degrees Celsius, that matters enormously. Continuous or near-continuous sunlight means systems can stay alive, habitats can stay warm, equipment can stay powered. The nightmare of surviving the lunar night becomes less impossible. Third, novelty. No human has ever been there. Every Apollo landing happened near the lunar equator. The South Pole is unexplored territory for human presence, which is precisely why it is scientifically and strategically so significant. If Artemis works, the South Pole could become the first place beyond Earth where human settlement stops being science fiction and starts becoming engineering. But getting there depends on the landers, and the 2 main contenders could hardly be more different. SpaceX's human landing system is a modified Starship, and it is absurdly large, about 165 feet tall, roughly the height of a 15-story building, the largest spacecraft ever designed to land on another celestial body. Because the crew cabin sits so high above the surface, astronauts will need an elevator system to travel from the hatch down to the moon. The propulsion system uses Raptor engines burning liquid methane and liquid oxygen. NASA has awarded SpaceX around $4.5 billion for this lander. On paper, Starship offers enormous capability, huge volume, big payloads, a platform that could redefine what lunar missions look like. But the engineering challenge is terrifying. Before one crewed lunar mission can happen, SpaceX may need 8 to 16 separate tanker launches to fill an orbital propellant depot. Then the actual lunar Starship launches, docks with that depot, and tops off for the trip to the moon. Depending on the final architecture, you could be looking at up to 17 launches just to enable a single landing. 17. One failure anywhere in that chain can break the mission. A launch anomaly, a docking issue, a refueling problem, boil-off losses, timing disruptions, everything cascades. And the most uncomfortable fact remains this: as of early 2026, nobody has ever successfully transferred cryogenic propellant between two separate spacecraft in orbit the way this architecture requires. Not NASA, not SpaceX, not anyone. SpaceX has demonstrated internal transfer within a single Starship. That is not the same thing. Moving cryogenic fluids between two free-flying vehicles in vacuum, while maintaining alignment and managing boil-off, is one of the hardest unsolved operational problems in the mission stack. That is why Starship is both the most exciting and the most dangerous piece of the Artemis puzzle. If it works, it changes everything. If it doesn't, it becomes the program's biggest trap. Blue Origin's Blue Moon Mark II takes a radically different approach. It is smaller, around 52 feet tall, roughly one-third the height of Starship. Astronauts walk down a short stairway rather than riding an elevator. It uses 3 BE-7 engines burning liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, each capable of producing about 44,000 newtons of thrust. The vehicle is designed to carry up to 4 astronauts for stays of up to 30 days and transport 20 metric tons of cargo in reusable mode, or 30 in expendable mode. NASA awarded Blue Origin $3.4 billion, and Blue reportedly put in over $3.4 billion more of its own money, pushing the total development effort somewhere around $7 billion. But Blue Moon is not just a Blue Origin vehicle. It is backed by a national team that includes Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Draper, Astrobotic, and Honeybee Robotics. In other words, it is a more traditional aerospace coalition, structurally different from SpaceX's vertically integrated style. So this race is not just between two landers. It is between two philosophies. Starship is scale, aggression, and complexity. Blue Moon is structure, partnership, and relative restraint. NASA is prepared to fly whichever one gets there first. Then there is the spacesuit situation, which sounds like a footnote until you realize how much it reveals about the broader transformation of Artemis. NASA's in-house suit program fell behind and went over budget, so the agency pivoted to a commercial approach. Axiom Space won the contract to develop the new lunar suit. Then Axiom pulled in Prada to help design the outer layer. It sounds almost ridiculous until you look at what the suit actually has to do: operate for 8-hour moonwalks, survive extreme thermal conditions, function in low sun angle environments at the South Pole, support communications, cameras, biometric monitoring, and modern life support, fit a dramatically wider range of body types than Apollo suits ever could. What sounds like a quirky style story is actually part of a bigger pattern. NASA is outsourcing critical infrastructure to commercial partners because the old way was too slow. Artemis V continues that pattern and takes the next step beyond simply landing people. It brings back something the Moon has not seen since Apollo 17, a rover. But this is not the old lunar buggy. NASA's lunar terrain vehicle requirements make the Apollo rover look primitive. The new vehicle must carry major cargo loads, travel meaningful daily distances, operate for long periods, survive the brutal lunar night, and function in 2 modes: crewed when astronauts are present and autonomous when they are not. That last part matters enormously. Between missions, the rover can scout terrain, collect science data, and prepare the environment for the next crew. That means every mission builds on the last. No more starting from scratch every time humans arrive. And that is the deepest difference between Apollo and Artemis. Apollo was a series of extraordinary camping trips. Land, explore briefly, take samples, leave. Nothing was built to last. Nothing was designed as infrastructure for the next crew. Artemis is cumulative. Every mission is supposed to add something permanent. That long-term mindset becomes explicit in NASA's March 2026 roadmap, which imagines 76 robotic and crewed landings delivering more than 200 metric tons of hardware to the lunar surface over roughly 7 years, with total spending around $20 billion for the 3 construction phases. Phase 1, running through 2028, focuses on proving reliability, early robotic assets, communications networks, survey systems, ice prospecting, terrain mapping. Proving the basics. Phase 2, through 2031, starts building the base itself. Habitats, solar and nuclear power systems, communication towers, pressurized rovers. Phase 3, through 2036, aims at permanent occupation, large power plants, industrial zones, systems for extracting oxygen and hydrogen from lunar material, water, rocket fuel, construction feedstock. The Moon stops being a place you visit and starts becoming a place that manufactures some of what it needs. This is the true endgame of Artemis, not a headline landing, not a nostalgic replay of Apollo. Settlement architecture. And that is exactly why the money matters so much. $93 billion is a staggering number. Every SLS launch cost roughly $4.1 billion. That is far more expensive than Saturn V on an inflation-adjusted basis. Oversight bodies have flagged billions in overruns. Budgets swing wildly depending on who is in power. One proposal cuts NASA deeply and suggests canceling SLS and Orion after Artemis II. Congress pushes back and injects money. Then new proposals slash again. The cycle never stabilizes. So Artemis sits in a dangerous zone where its engineering challenges are matched by political instability. And yet the budget fights almost start to look small when you place them next to the strategic pressure hanging over everything. China. China's lunar program is not vaporware. It is not a wish list. It has executed major milestones on or ahead of schedule. It landed on the far side of the moon. It returned the first samples from that far side in 2024. It is building toward a crewed lunar landing by 2030 and developing the broader architecture for an international lunar research station with multiple partner nations. That changes the psychological frame of Artemis entirely. This is no longer just about scientific exploration or national prestige in the abstract. It is about who gets there first, who builds first, who shapes norms first, and who turns lunar presence into geopolitical leverage. Isaac Mann has framed it in exactly those terms. The clock is running. Success or failure will be measured in months, not years. That urgency is why he blew up the old plan. Because from his perspective, a beautiful architecture that cannot deliver in time is worse than useless. It becomes a liability. At the same time, Artemis is also a diplomatic machine. The Artemis Accords have grown from 8 signatories in 2020 to 61 countries by January 2026. ESA powers Orion through the European Service Module. JAXA is tied into rover development. Canada has already flown a lunar mission astronaut. The coalition is real, but so is the tension. China and Russia remain outside that framework and criticize it as a US-centric attempt to shape space law. So the moon is no longer just a scientific frontier. It is a political frontier, an industrial frontier, a legal frontier. And maybe the most important sentence in the whole Artemis story is this: the program is no longer fundamentally about going to the moon. It is about staying there. That is the difference. That is why the South Pole matters. That is why lunar water matters. That is why sunlight on ridgelines matters. That is why autonomous rovers matter. That is why habitats, power systems, and fuel extraction matter. Apollo proved humans could reach the moon. Artemis is trying to prove humans can remain. And right now, that effort sits in a strange, tense, half-rewritten state. Artemis II has flown around the moon and returned safely. Artemis III has been demoted from a landing to an orbital systems test. Artemis IV has inherited the burden of history. Artemis V points toward operational continuity. The lunar station has been paused. The upgraded rocket version has been killed. The launch platform has been frozen. The whole sequence has been rewritten around a harsher principle: test before you leap. It is a more conservative strategy, but also a more ruthless one. It admits what the previous plan tried to hide. You do not get permanence on the moon by faking readiness. Still, the uncertainties remain enormous. Neither SpaceX nor Blue Origin has demonstrated the full set of capabilities needed for a crew-rated lunar landing. Orbital refueling remains unproven. International partners are still adjusting to the gateway shock. The political class continues to swing between huge support and proposed cuts. The 2028 landing timeline is aggressive even by optimistic standards. So after $93 billion, after repeated delays, after the cancellation or suspension of major pillars of the old architecture, NASA is effectively making one giant bet: that a slower, more honest, more incremental path can get humans back to the moon in a way that actually leads somewhere. Not back for a photo, back for a foothold, back for infrastructure, back for permanence. And that is what makes this story so much bigger than a schedule update or a procurement fight or another round of space policy drama. What is being rewritten here is not just the next mission. It is the entire logic of human expansion beyond Earth. If Artemis succeeds, history will remember this moment not as the collapse of a plan, but as the brutal correction that made the real one possible. If it fails, then the $93 billion will stand as one of the most expensive examples of ambition outrunning execution in the history of science. That is the knife edge NASA is standing on right now. A lunar return program that had to admit it was broken. A new administrator willing to kill sacred projects to save the mission. A competition between two private giants racing to deliver the machine that will carry humans down to the South Pole. A target region holding ancient ice, near-eternal sunlight, and the first real possibility of off-world industry. a political system that cannot decide whether to fund this future or cut it apart, and a rival power moving fast enough to turn every delay into a strategic risk. That is where Artemis stands, 3 missions away from the first crewed lunar landing in over half a century, 1 successful test away from making the architecture believable, 1 failure away from another spiral of delays, and somewhere beyond all of it lies the real prize, the thing this whole program is secretly about. The moment the moon stops being a destination and starts becoming a place where human civilization actually functions. That is the dream, that is the gamble. And after everything NASA has torn up and rewritten, after all the billions already spent and all the uncertainty still ahead, the single biggest question in space exploration remains brutally simple. Can they actually pull it off this time? Because this time, the goal is not just to touch the moon, it is to begin making it part of the human world.